Welcome to Asian Book Club, where we highlight Asian and Asian American authors. We are your hosts,
Jamae and Sabangan.
and I'm Stephen Park. And today we bring you Read 2 of Where I Belong, Healing Trauma and Embracing Asian American Identity by Sujin Lee and Linda Yoon. This read was helpful. It was enlightening. It taught a lot about the deeper trauma responses.
Mm-hmm.
One of the things that it really helped me learn about was that there aren't just two trauma responses, which is what I always thought it was. Like the way that Psychology 101 teaches us facing trauma, like in the face of danger, is a flight or fight response.
Mm-hmm.
But as we learn from Sujin and Linda, there are actually four different types of responses.
Mm-hmm.
So it's fight, flight, freeze, and fawn.
Yes.
Fight is you acting against a situation, flight is trying to run away, freeze is just standing still, and fawn is kind of like giving into the situation a little bit.
Mm-hmm. It's kind of a way to please and appease.
Yeah. So, what I wanted to talk about in our segment here is kind of what our trauma responses are and how it affects us a little bit.
Mm-hmm.
Because you and I have very different trauma responses.
Yes.
So my response usually is a very much a fight response. It's
Mm-hmm.
in the face of danger, in the face of threat, in the face of something that is provoking the situation. My brain immediately thinks that I have to act upon it and try to figure out maybe not a solution, but a point where we can create a pause that can carry us forward.
Hmm. And I'm very different in that I tend to fawn. I tend to try to appease everyone, make sure that everyone feels good, even though I'm not feeling good. And that looks like me crying. It looks like me trying to barter and exchange situations like, if I do this, can you do this? So it's making it like a lose-lose situation for myself.
Yeah, and these responses can come out when we're in arguments. I think for most people, arguments are not a peaceful situation. They're traumatic. They're places that we don't want to be. So our natural defense mechanisms might show.
Mm-hmm.
And with our responses being so different, it does create a clash when we are trying to resolve situations.
For sure.
Because for me, I am trying to get to the bottom of something. You do kind of get to a point where you're trying to figure things out. So it's a more methodical process. And
Mm.
it's just, it counters how my brain is processing information, which I'm sure from your side, the way my efforts go are countering the way that your brain is trying to process things.
Definitely. When I'm processing, it feels like so little time, but for you, when you're trying to get to the heart of the matter and getting towards a solution or towards an ending point, my brain is still like just piecing things together.
Yeah, and while that's happening in my brain, I've done laps around situations. So we are just on different end of things. I mean, we've had this conversation before. Like this has been something we've tried to figure out in terms of making it work. But the value of being able to read a book like this, being able to see this information is to explain, especially to me, what your response might be. Because you've always told me what you're feeling, but for me, it didn't make sense.
Hmm.
I think what this book does is say, this is the reason why it's happening. Like, this isn't just something that feels slower. It's not that it's more real, but it does make it feel like something that I'm able to better understand.
For sure. And it allows me to feel like I'm heard and understood while also understanding where you're coming from.
Yeah. And one thing that they do mention is that all of these responses are there for a reason.
Mm-hmm.
People have developed, whether it's fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, you've developed it because it's helped you survive, it's helped you move forward. So there is no such thing as a wrong trauma response. Everyone has their own way of managing it. It's just about maybe understanding a little bit better so that we can then utilize what other people have and better create scenarios that we can all be successful in together.
Right.
We'll learn a little bit more about the trauma responses, but we'll go deeper into the rest of the read. But before we do that, if you need a break that maybe lightens up the mood and maybe want to even see a live show, there's someone that you can follow, and that's going to be our recommendation for the week.
Our recommendation for the week is Mo Amer. Mohammed Mo Amer is a comedian and actor. His performances can be described as conversational and charismatic. He is known for his stand-up comedy specials like Muhammad in Texas and his show Mo that's loosely based on his life as a Palestinian refugee. Currently, in 2025, he's touring around the United States. You can learn more about Mo Amer through his website at moamer.com. That's moamer.com, and on Instagram at Mo Amer.
Yep. And when he comes to Portland, me and Jamae are very excited because we got tickets to go to his show.
Yes.
We have really enjoyed his take on American life. And he's not only from Texas, but he's from Houston, Texas, which he's very proud of. And
Mm-hmm.
yeah, I also highly recommend that you go ahead and follow him and watch some of his stand up specials. But that is going to be our recommendation for the week. Okay, so read two of Where I Belong by Sujin Lee and Linda Yoon. Our second read involved pages 71 through 150, which was chapter 3, Our Body's Response to Racial Identities, through chapter 6, Journey to Trauma Healing. Let's get a little recap of what we learned in the last episode.
In the last episode, we talked about invisible trauma and how that comes about. We also talked about the rise of the model minority myth and the racial positioning of Asian Americans in the United States.
Yep, so it kind of went over more of the topics that cover the realm of what we exist like for Asian Americans.
Right, it created the context for us.
Yeah, and now what it seems like we got from this next read is much more of the personal, much more of the individual. So, one of those thoughts being how we tend to balance what we feel and what's going on kind of extraneous to us.
Mm-hmm. And Linda Yoon and Sujin Lee call it homeostasis in the book. It's where the mind compensates to find the sense of balance in order to survive.
Yep, and homeostasis is a biological term. It's meant to talk about a lot of different things, like what your body's temperature might be for homeostasis. We'd use it psychologically to talk about our mental state of being. And yeah, for this one, it talks about our well being within maybe stressful situations that might throw it off from us being well.
Right. And one of the examples that they share is that when you feel like something's off or something is not right, it's that imbalance of homeostasis. It makes us try to figure out what makes it off and how we can make it right again.
Yeah, and within that, we are structures and beings that are able to tolerate certain amount of being thrown off,
Mm-hmm.
or in this sense, our ability to cope with different kind of stressors.
Mm-hmm.
What this is defined as in the book is the window of tolerance.
Mm-hmm. And with this window of tolerance, it can either grow or narrow. Traumatic experiences narrows this window of tolerance, and then in the opposite end, when we find those coping mechanisms and those grounding exercises, it helps us widen this window of tolerance.
Speaking of those coping mechanisms, that's where we were educated on the four F's of fight, flight, freeze, and fawn
Mm-hmm.
as strategies for creating a larger window of tolerance, like the way that we can maybe get through a workday, the way that we might be able to get through an argument or through, I don't know, like for me, I have social anxiety. So how do I get through being in a large crowd of people if I have to like shop at the mall for getting presents or something?
Definitely. And in addition to coping, it's also the grounding exercises, just like the box breathing that we did in the first episode, or the grounding exercise where you're using your five senses, the sensorial exercise, in order to feel safe again.
Yeah. And we are able to pick up a couple of new grounding exercises, one of which was super fascinating. It talked about your ability to cope with intergenerational trauma,
Mm,
which intergenerational trauma is something that is kind of within your bloodline, it's within your system, and it's not something that you may be able to physically put attention to, but it's something that you just feel.
yeah.
And the exercise that they gave, without over explaining it, is one where you sit back and you kind of put yourself within the doors of your ancestors and you're able to kind of go in and try to find resolution within the things that might be hurting you from more of that bloodline effect.
Right. It's either getting a resolution or getting more wisdom from your ancestors in order to manage it.
Yeah, did you pay attention to that exercise? Like, did you do it yourself?
I did. And it reminded me of when Cassandra Lamb of Collective Rest would do this with our community rest sessions.
This was my first time doing this, and it was fascinating. Like, the mind is a powerful object. It
Yes.
can create, it can take away. Like, you can completely ignore a person standing in front of you, or you can create a new person right in front of you and fully believe that that person's there. So,
Mm-hmm.
the mind's powerful. When I was doing this exercise, it really felt like I was tapping into someone that I didn't know.
Mm.
I was looking kind of at my dad's dad, so my grandfather, who I've never met. He passed away before I was born.
Mm.
And all I could feel was his presence. One of the things that you do in the exercise is saying words that might bring you calmness or kind of ease the comfort of some of the stress that might be there.
Totally.
And it truly felt like a relief. Like it felt like there was an uplifting,
Mm.
and to a very real extent, it was not a real conversation I had with my grandfather. Like, I don't believe that that was true, but there was absolutely a feeling of relief as if it had come from him. And knowing the stories about him and how caring he was, it felt like the words that would have come out of his mouth if we were able to open our hearts to each other.
For sure. It's very spiritual in a sense, and it's stretching the imagination, if you will, for those who don't have a spiritual practice. But what I've been taught and what I believe is that we are the amalgamation of our ancestors. And so our ancestors are within us, even though we've never met them.
Yeah. So I don't know, maybe it was a real experience.
Mm-hmm.
It was traumatizing to try to relieve the trauma.
Mm.
I mean, I guess not traumatizing, but it was just, it was a whole experience. Like, I
Mm.
almost cried coming out of that, like, exercise.
For sure.
There is another thing to be stated with intergenerational trauma, which is that the thing that's happening within your heart may not be your fault,
Yes.
or it's not really your fault.
Right. The violence itself doesn't have to happen to you directly for you to be affected and traumatized.
Right. So the trauma that we carry over generations that are handed down to you is not something that really was something of your control, but can definitely live in your soul and your spirit.
Yes, exactly. For example, with the people in the Philippines, they went through hundreds of years of colonization from the Spaniards. And so that, even though I wasn't living in that situation, I still feel the effects of that. I still know that the current situation where the Philippines government is influenced by the United States government because of the war between the Spanish and the US still is functioning today. I feel that. I still feel it.
Yeah. And I don't think there are many places in this world that have been immune to having something happen to that country.
Mm,
I mean, in the United States, the trauma is not maybe within the European settlers, but there is a massive amount of trauma within the native people of the land. So
hmm.
there's a lot there. And I think it's hard to really disconnect yourself truly from that if
Yes.
that is something that just lives with you.
Hmm.
Which then brings us to the shame that Americans should feel. But more talking about shame and more talking about guilt that involve in our lives.
Definitely. We tend to use shame and guilt interchangeably, but the book outlines the difference between the two.
Hmm.
Guilt is saying to yourself, I did something bad. It's focusing on the action. While shame is saying, I am bad. It's focusing on the person.
Right. So you could be guilty of maybe not going to that party or like not remembering someone's birthday or
Hmm.
things like that. Whereas shame is, I'm a bad person for not going to that party. I'm a
Right.
terrible person for not remembering that person's birthday.
Right.
So it's two situations that can be viewed very differently, and have a very different effect on how it enters your body.
Right. I feel like guilt allows us to see the trouble outside of ourselves so we don't beat ourselves up for it, while shame is so internal that it starts to fester if we keep talking to ourselves that way.
Which I believe a lot of Asian American experiences are built on shame.
Mm-hmm.
Like, not making good grades wasn't because I couldn't do it or I even slacked off. Like, it wasn't because I didn't do that act. It's because I wasn't good enough and I wasn't able to represent my family in this way. And
Mm.
that's stuff that you just carry with you. Like, people talk about not being able to work the careers that their parents wanted, not being able to do so much that their families looked for them to do,
Mm-hmm.
and then they carry that with them forever. And I mean, sometimes it even gets to the point where drugs and alcohol become involved. And I mean, in Korea specifically, we look at the things that are happening there, and if suicide is a trigger warning, I'm going to talk very briefly about it. But suicide does happen in Korea often because of the shame that people feel. It's not that they did one thing wrong, it's they feel like the one thing that they did was such a big effect on who they were, and not just them, but the people around them.
Mm-hmm. The collective ends up influencing their thoughts, which makes them feel like it's a big situation that needs to be addressed, or in another sense, addressed in a way that removes them from the world.
Yeah, it's tough. It's hard to really sit in the moments that you have these experiences and say, I feel guilty about it rather than I feel shameful,
Mm-hmm.
especially when that's stuff that we learn from an early age. But it's something that I think once we get a better handle of, the things that we may not be able to do correctly, which no one does everything correctly, won't maybe fit into the identity of who we are.
Mm-hmm.
Like, we may still be good people and just do wrong things.
Yeah. Do you feel like you still carry the shame that you carried as a young person?
I think there's always gonna be shame. I don't think what the book is mentioning is that no one should ever have shame, or
Mm.
I guess they don't really go into that,
Mm-hmm.
but it's not great to have shame, but I think it's a part of who we are if we see ourselves as a society,
Mm.
which is something that they mention. It's like usually Asian Americans or Asians think about themselves as community.
Mm-hmm.
So, in that sense, there is going to be a certain amount that you want to uphold who you are. And for me, I very much want to uphold my last name. I want to uphold me as a Korean person, me as an individual that may not fit into the white society that we've grown up in.
Mm.
So I am always trying to be better. And so I think if I do something wrong, my initial thought is shame. It's that I did something wrong and there is something wrong with me.
Mm.
And it's hard, but I do think that that's what this book is for, is to start realizing that that is what's happening. Because prior to this, I don't think that that's what my brain immediately went to.
For sure. Not in this book, like you said, but in other readings that I've done, the goal is to move shame outside of ourselves into guilt, to remind us that, like you said, we're good people who do wrong things sometimes. That's not to say that we're always going to shirk responsibility. You're still responsible. You still did the wrong thing. You still did something not nice. But it is to say that rather than trying to burden ourselves, burden our spirits with that shame, it's moving the shame outside.
It goes into a much larger context of, I think, who we are as individuals and communities.
Mm-hmm.
It's not an easy conversation or an
Mm-hmm.
easy thought to process,
Mm-hmm.
but at least opening that door of separating these words and being able to distinguish that shame and guilt are different is a pretty good start to that conversation.
Absolutely.
Along with that, another deep connection we tend to have with ourselves is this feeling of grief.
Mm-hmm. And when we think about grief, a lot of people think about death and grieving a loss. But something that I learned not only in this book, but recently is that grief can be just the what ifs. What if my family stayed in our home country? What if my parents could better communicate with me? What if I learned to speak my mother tongue when I was younger?
Yeah, and for a lot of us whose parents have immigrated to the United States, the story is the same. It's my parent was a doctor, my parent was an engineer, my parent did a role for society that was very important, but moving here, they didn't have the time, they didn't have the language, they didn't have the ability to move forward and carry over that legacy that they worked so hard in the home country to get.
Exactly.
And then you come here and then you find ways to survive, and then that question does come up of, what if these things were different?
Mm-hmm.
For me, sometimes the question is, what if I worked a different profession? What if I went a different route? What if my parents knew that medical was not the only route to take? Like, there are always going to be these what ifs,
Mm-hmm.
but the grief aspect comes from mourning that loss. It comes from thinking that things could be better on the other side.
True. I feel like this grief kind of follows me like a little puppy. It doesn't always catch my attention, but it continuously reminds me that it's there.
Like a little sad puppy just
Yes.
being pulled along on a leash.
Yes, exactly. It might not even be on a leash, which is why, like, for me, I'm trying to let it go, but it keeps following me.
Do you think that grief is something that needs to be let go?
I feel like over time, grief will be muted, but not necessarily gone.
But do you want that grief to be gone?
Hmm. Honestly, I don't think I want it to be gone because if it's gone, then I no longer have that connection to context. I no longer have that connection to my background or myself. For example, the question about language and mother tongue. Without the grief, I would not want to continuously practice my language. Well, technically, Tagalog is not my language, but that's a different story. But if it weren't for that grief, I wouldn't want to keep practicing. If it weren't for the grief, I wouldn't keep looking for situations where I could use the language.
Yeah, and I do think grief is much more in the morning,
Mm-hmm.
but I think these questions and these unresolved responses sometimes are what drives us forward. It's also the what if that may not be the bad thing. Like,
Mm.
what if leaving the home country wasn't the worst decision? What if it saved your life? What if
Mm-hmm.
it brought you the spouse that you didn't find over there, but you found here? So I don't know. I think of these questions as good questions to carry forward. But yeah, grief is different. It's that feeling like you lost something, but we're always going to lose something. Like you make a choice, the other choice isn't there. It's just how life works.
True. And the book does mention that the Asian American diasporic experience is marked by absences and losses. We
Yeah.
continuously lose something in order to gain something else.
Yeah. And that's how a lot of us have gotten to the positions that we are in. It's something that is worth diving into. It's definitely something just figuring out like what is your grief? Like what
Mm,
are the things that you may feel like you have maybe lost out in experience with,
for sure.
but also recognizing maybe on the brighter side that you've probably gained something from the other door that you entered.
Mm-hmm. Yes, definitely.
All of this has just been a piece of what we've read.
Mm-hmm.
It's hard to really summarize the amount of context that they put into these situations and scenarios within just a podcast. And, the reason why we break up these podcasts is so we can do a better deep dive on things like homeostasis and shame and guilt and things like that. But
Mm-hmm.
truly, the whole point of us reading and trying to share this material is to also have you feel like you want to read along with us and maybe figure out things that are more unique to you, the experiences that you may realize. Like the shame and guilt thing was a big part for me of just being able to segment the two ideologies.
Mm-hmm.
I think this book is teaching me a lot. The individual stories are helping me digest it, and I'm excited to move forward.
For sure. The book also helps us, like we mentioned before, with the grounding exercises and with the journal prompts to allow us to digest, but also to help us figure out what it is that we're actually feeling, not what we think we should feel. And it lets us begin to figure out ways to better cope with the stresses, with the shame, with the guilt, with the grief.
Mhm. It's like having a therapist or two therapists help you along a journey.
Yes.
Along with that, our next journey is going to be our third read, and that's going to be,
Pages 151 through 230 on the physical copy, but for everyone, that'll be chapter 7, Cultivating Self Compassion, through chapter 9, Embracing Our Intersectional Identities.
yeah, and for anyone that feels like they're connecting with the book, I'd be very excited to hear what you're connecting with.
Mm-hmm.
But if you did want to reach out to us, how can people do so?
You can email us at asianbookclubpod@gmail.com, or you can reach out to us through Instagram at asianbookclubpod.
We also have our website, which is asianbookclubpod.com, where we have books that we've read in the past, books that we recommend, and books that we plan to read in the future.
And a great way to support us is to rate, review, and subscribe to the podcast.
Otherwise, make sure to be happy, be healthy, and read a book.
Ingat! Bye.